My name is Charlene Margot, and I'm co-founder of nonprofit The Parent Venture, which brings the program, the Parent Education Series, as you see tonight. We are so honored to be here with you all. And for some opening remarks, I'm going to give you to Allison Lanier, Associate Superintendent for the Cupertino Union School District. Allison.
Hi, everyone. I'm so pleased to see everybody here this evening. Before we begin, I do want to acknowledge that this event has been sponsored by CEEF, our foundation, and we'll be having additional events throughout the year, thanks to the generosity of CEEF and our wonderful community donors. So thank you, everybody, for that. We wanted to put together a special event for our 3 schools that are impacted by closure and consolidation. We've been getting some questions from parents about the best ways to talk to kids about change. How can we best work with the kids and talk to the kids so that as they navigate a time of change, that they can feel a sense of confidence and I can do it through this time. So we bring you this event tonight to help bring some tools to you and to invite you to ask questions around that topic. We, this afternoon, did a similar session for staff, and it was wonderful to put our heads together around that and in support of our wonderful kids. So thank you for being here. We're going to start with the presentation, and then there will be a time for question and answer towards the end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Allison, for those remarks. We are honored to be with you tonight. And again, as she mentioned, very grateful for the sponsorship of CEEF and our new partnership with the Cupertino Union School District. Again, my name is Charlene Margot, founder of the Parent Venture, and we're going to be welcoming you parents and caregivers to all of our virtual programming this year. But tonight's event is special. And we are so excited to have with us Dr. Bill Stixrud and Ned Johnson, authors of the new book, What Do You Say?, which we recommend highly, as well as their first book, The Self-Driven Child. Before I tell you a little bit about our presenters, just quickly, format-wise, as Allison mentioned, this is a webinar tonight, so you attendees have 2 ways to interact with us. There's both a chat button where my partner, Bev Hartman, will be putting resource links, so you can ask, you can tell us things, you can look at the resources that'll be posted in chat. But for questions, we ask that you put them in the Q&A button. So again, you're welcome to put questions in anytime during the presentation tonight. We're going to have 45 or 50 minutes of content, followed by open-ended question time for you, the audience. So please do keep your questions coming. We will get to them as many as we can this evening. Also, again, this event is being recorded. We partner with the Boys and Girls Club of the Peninsula to do our videography. So the link will be available shortly and sent out to you as a private link so that you can view it and share with partners or others that you would like to see tonight's presentation. All right, well, let me tell you a little bit about tonight's featured speakers. First of all, William Stixrud, PhD, is a clinical neuropsychologist and founder of the Stixrud Group, as well as a faculty member at Children's National Medical Center and assistant professor of psychiatry and pediatrics at the George Washington University School of Medicine. He is also on the board of the David Lynch Foundation. Dr. Stixrud's work has been featured in national media outlets such as NPR, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and Scientific American. He is also the author with Ned Johnson of the national best-selling book, The Self-Driven Child, and their brand new book, What Do You Say? Talking with Kids to Build Motivation, Stress Tolerance, and a Happy Home. Welcome back, Bill.
Thank you, Charlene.
Ned Johnson is an author, speaker, and founder of Prep Matters, an educational company providing academic tutoring, educational planning, and standardized test preparation. A professional tutor geek since 1993, Ned has spent more than 40,000 hours helping students conquer standardized tests, learn to manage their anxiety, and find the motivation to reach their full potential. In 2006, Ned co-authored the book Conquering the SAT, which tackles the outsized role that anxiety plays in standardized testing. He is the host of the Prep Talks podcast and a sought-after speaker and teen coach on study skills, sleep deprivation, parent-teen dynamics, and anxiety. His work has been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, NPR, the BBC, and many others. Please join me in a really warm welcome tonight for Dr. Bill Stixrud and Ned Johnson. Take it away, gentlemen.
Thank you so much, Charlene and Allison. It's great to be here. And I test kids for a living. If they have any kind of difficulty, I try to figure out what's wrong and how to help them. And I never get tired of it. In part because I just love what kids say. A few years ago, I was testing a 7-year-old girl, and I asked her, well, what kind of things are stressful for you? She said, well, just yesterday, I was in class and the teacher said, what's the biggest number in the world? And I said, 23,000. And the teacher said, well, what about 20,001? I said, I was so close. But it's good work. But in any case, everybody knows this is a really stressful time. And even before the pandemic, people were talking about an epidemic of mental health problems in children and teenagers and young adults, including anxiety, depression, loneliness. And the pandemic hasn't helped. And also your situation where your 3 schools are closing, it's obviously very stressful. And it's predictable because we know that what makes life stressful can be summarized with the acronym NUTS. It's the acronym NUTS. And it's novelty, unpredictability, perceived threat, and a low sense of control. And presumably the situation you folks experience, it kind of involves all 4. And so it's predictably stressful. And Ned and I, our first book, part of what we emphasized in our first book is that being chronically stressed is terrible for kids' brains. We don't want kids to grow up being chronically tired and chronically stressed. It just increases their risk for anxiety, depression, substance use. And people say that depression scars the developing brain in a way that just predisposes it or makes it more likely that they'll have problems later on. So we don't want kids to be chronically stressed. And we know that kids in high achieving schools and affluent communities are at even higher risk for anxiety and depression and substance use disorders than middle class kids are. And so we don't want kids to be chronically stressed. At the same time, unless the kids have the experience of dealing with stressful situations, being able to cope with them, they don't develop a brain that has the confidence that I can cope with stressful situations. And the theme of our first book, The Self-Driven Child, is that one of the most important things we can help kids develop as they grow up is a healthy sense of control of their own lives. And that simply, an opposite of sense of control is feeling hopeless or passive or nothing I can do about it, or feeling overwhelmed and chronically just anxiously driven. It's that healthy sense of control. This is my life and I can direct my own life. It's beneficial for everything. And the kids don't develop that healthy sense of control unless they have the experience of being able to handle stressful situations. And Tina Payne Bryson, who's written some wonderful books for parents, says that the formula for developing resilience is adversity plus support. So just adversity, it doesn't do it, but the adversity with support, kids actually become stronger. And the model that we use to really understand the sense of control is based on work at the University of Colorado by a guy named Steve Mayer. And Steve Mayer's classic study, rat A and rat B, they're in plexiglass cages, their tails outside the cage, little electrode on their tails. There's a wheel inside the cage. Rat A gets shocked. He discovers if he turns the wheel, the shock stops. Rat B turns the wheel when he gets shocked and nothing happens. His shock only stops when rat A turns the wheel. Rat A, basically, when he's being stressed, the prefrontal cortex in the brain activates big time. And when the prefrontal cortex activates in animals and in humans, it dampens down the stress response. So rat A goes into coping mode, turning that wheel. And even eventually, when they disconnect the wheel, rat A still stays in coping mode. It's not that stressful because he's just had that experience. I can control stressful situations. Rat B, who got rescued by rat A but didn't deal with it himself, becomes a nervous wreck. And so we don't want to protect kids from all manner of challenge or difficulty because they just don't develop the courage, the resilience, that high stress tolerance that they need for really for good mental health. And I'll just mention too that it's not, there's a lot of interesting work on what they call learned helplessness, where classic study, a dog in a cage and it gets shocked repeatedly and it can't get out. You open the cage and eventually the dog doesn't get out, and it just stays there. And it turns out that the problem was the dog did not learn a sense of control. And so it's the people who study this say a healthy sense of control inoculates you from the harmful effects of stress. And one of the most important things, let's say this, there's a really interesting new program for treating anxiety in children and teenagers that only works with parents. It's called the SPACE program. And it stands for Supportive Parenting of Anxious Childhood Emotions. And the premise is that when kids are anxious, that we make accommodations, we adjust the way we do things in a way that actually makes them more anxious. And what we want to do is learn how to not do that, and also to make what they call supportive statements, which are, I know this makes you really anxious, but I'm 100% confident you can handle it. And that expression of confidence that kids can handle even hard stuff is one of the most powerful things we can do to help our kids develop this high stress tolerance and resilience. And in our first book, The Self-Driven Child, we talk about the sense of control. And in our new book, we talked about communication. We said, let's take a step back and talk about the real fundamental purpose of communication, which is building close connections with your kids. And Ned, why don't you talk about that?
I think one of the more sort of insightful and rewarding parts of preparing for this book is we spoke with really dozens of teens and kids and young adults and asked them, who do you feel closest to? And part of this was in The Self-Driven Child, we talk about a model for intrinsic motivation that holds that you need competency, this autonomy that Bill talked about, and closeness or connection or relatedness. So this relatedness piece is really important. Close connection also turns out is about as close as you get to a silver bullet against the effects of anxiety and stress on developing brains. So it's pretty important stuff. So when we met with these kids, we would ask them, so who do you feel closest to? And sometimes it was my mom, it was my dad, but sometimes it was my grandma, my cousin, my aunt, my uncle, my teacher, my coach. We said, well, what is it about them that makes you feel close to them? And the answers really came in kind of two flavors. One was, they listen to me without judging me. And two, they don't tell me what to do all the time. And this makes a ton of sense, because if you bring a problem to someone and the person starts telling you, you should have done this, you should have done that, if you think about it this way, it doesn't feel too good, right? You want to be able to, we all want to, and we want our kids to be able to, with us, share with us what's going on, right? And it's the experience of being understood, that the other person is trying to hear where you're coming from, that really calms hard emotions, as opposed to logic. And one of the challenges when people, including our kids, bring problems to us, we naturally want to sort of like, we should have done this, you should have, and that's not really the what science doesn't really support that as the way to get to calm those hard emotions. Helping kids calm hard emotions through our conversation, through our modeling, is really valuable. One, because it's sharing hard emotions that makes us close to other people. So when our kids have stuff going on, they're really upset, they're bent out of shape, and they feel that they can come and share those things with us. And again, we'll listen, we'll hear them, and we won't start judging them. It's really a balm. It's really a tonic that they know that they can go out in real life and it's tough, and they can come back, and mom and dad are gonna help them deal better with this. And the close connection is really, really valuable. It's also what helps them calm their brains such that the prefrontal cortex, this kind of recently evolved part of the brain, can jump into that coping mode that Bill talked about, where they can start looking for solutions to their problems for themselves, and they can start putting things into perspective for themselves. So the entire first chapter of our book is about the language of how we establish empathy, how we establish validation. And so a really simple example, I mean, we've all probably had the experience, or you can imagine, where a kid comes home and they bombed a test and they're all spun up about this and they're carrying on about how it was so unfair and they studied like crazy and it wasn't the teacher put things on there and blah, 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 blah. And as a parent, you're thinking like, really? I don't know about study so hard, kiddo. I saw you watching, on your phone the whole darn time and the teacher's pretty straightforward and like, really? Or you start saying, well, it's not that big a deal. It's only one test. You'll do better next time. The semester is very long, all of which is true. But it isn't really validating, meaning it isn't saying that the kid has a reason to feel the way that they feel. Even if they're not right, they have a reason in their head to feel the way that they feel. So the validation would be something simply like, gosh, it must be pretty frustrating to feel like you really did terribly on a test when you really wanted to do well. Or, to feel like there were things on the test that you hadn't been well prepared for. Note that I don't agree with a set of facts. I didn't say the teacher didn't teach you. I didn't say you studied really hard. I say it must feel really bad. It makes sense that you're upset if you feel like you studied hard and it didn't go well. And then really it's the experience of trying to feel a feeling understood that helps calm those hard emotions. Now, one really fun tool that we talk about in our book, there's a wonderful guy named Ron McGinn, who many of you may have seen. Charlene and Bev had him in a month or two ago, if I remember correctly, Charlene. And he has kind of the modern iteration of what is known as reflective listening, which is kind of the most foundational tool in all of psychology, where we kind of repeat back to people what we think we heard so that they feel that we're working hard to understand where they're coming from. And so Ron McGinn, his take on this is WIGGing, which stands for what I got is. And so again, the kid says, I studied really hard. So what you're telling me is you studied really hard in this, and you feel like you studied really hard, but you did really poorly, and the teacher put things on there that didn't prepare for it. Do I have that about right? Yeah, that's so true. And it can be really powerful, and also buys us as parents time to figure out what our next move is. What do we say? I'll share the story. Last time Bill and I, well, pre-COVID, we're out in your corner of the world, giving a talk about our book, The Self-Driven Child. The next day, we got an email from Charlene describing from a parent who'd said, I came to your talk. I heard this. I came home after the talk and I found my seventh grader approached me and he was just in tears. He was all spun up and said, Mom, I'm the weakest kid in all of seventh grade. And he was just fit to be tied. And she said, normally I would have said things like, oh, sweetheart, that can't possibly be true. Or you have so many other gifts, strength isn't everything. You're a person of the mind. Or I would have jumped into how we can help him get stronger. But I didn't do those things. Rather, I simply used these tools and I said, well, golly, that sucks. I'd be really upset too if I felt like I was really weak. If I felt like I was the weakest kid and everyone else was stronger than me and I really wanted to be strong. She said, yeah, it sure is. And they had this conversation where she basically just said, gosh, that would be hard, and reflected it back to him. And that, rather than trying to solve the problem in the moment, is what calmed his hardest emotions. So she said, I gave him a hug, I gave him a kiss. He went to bed, I went to bed. I'm like, what are we going to do? Here's the great thing. The next morning, the kid comes down to breakfast with a plan, a written plan for how he's going to gain strength, and asks his mom help. And she said, it was unbelievable. And it doesn't always work out this way, but so much of the advice that we've tried to share, from our lived experience in this book is not so much about the what necessarily, but about the how. Because as parents, who knows your kids better than you do? Who loves them more than you do? But we want to give advice that is heard, right? And the way that we first do this is by leaning in with empathy and validation. And then we can get buy-in and transition into giving advice. And what Bill will talk about is really trying to be a consultant to our kids, which is really the collaborative way that we have found so effective in working with kids, particularly when things aren't going so well.
And in our new book, what do you say? We also talk about some of the other tools you can use to really build that strong connection. And one of them is simply spending time alone with your kids. I mean, many of them, we're all busy and a lot of people spend family time. But what really makes that builds that connection and makes it really strong is spending time alone. And I feel fortunate. I learned this when my kids were very little, sometime that they were probably 4 until they left for college. I scheduled an hour a week on every day on Sundays with each one of them, just doing something that was kind of mutually enjoyable. And it's a really powerful way to stay connected. And so we start out our new book talking about the language that we can use to build that closeness and connection. And then we revisit some of the themes we talk about in our first book, The Self-Driven Child. And one is the idea that we think that as kids get older, it makes sense for us as parents to think about ourselves more as consultants to the kids, whose job it is to help the kids figure out who they want to be, what kind of life they want, and how to create it, than it is the kid's boss or manager or the homework police. And part of the idea is that we want kids that we see so many kids going out, including the kids of the most elite colleges, who are home by November. And to the one, they simply don't have enough experience running their own life. And we want kids to be able to run their own life successfully and not run it into the ground while they're living at home before they go off to college. So there's three implications as we move into this parent as consultant role. One is that we offer help, we offer advice, but we don't try to force it down kids' throats. Ned has this great cartoon. It's the dad holding his two sons by the nape of the neck and saying, "Listen up, boys, and listen up good, because I'm only going to tell you this a million times." And so many parents say, how do I get them to see? How I'm trying to make them understand. And what we want to try to do is we want to offer our perspective, offer our wisdom, offer our experience, and not force it. So that's the first implication. The second is, as much as possible, we want to encourage kids to make their own decisions, because part of being able to run your own life is being a good decision maker. And part of being a good decision maker is practicing. And I felt my whole career that the best message you can give a teenager is that I have confidence in your ability to make decisions about your own life and to learn from your mistakes. And I want you to have a ton of experience doing that before I send you off to college. And with little kids, we want to express confidence that they can make good decisions with our help, thinking through pros and cons. So it's supporting decision making, and is the second. And the third is that we want, where possible, we want kids to solve their own problems. And that's because if a 3-year-old or a 5-year-old or a 10-year-old or a 14-year-old is having a problem and tries to solve it him or herself, the kid goes into coping mode. And when that happens, the prefrontal cortex of the brain activates and it dampens down the stress response. So it's not as stressful if you go into coping mode as opposed to getting freaking out. We want kids to have a lot of experience doing that. If something stressful happens and they figure it out, we want to support them. And if they're overwhelmed, we want to help them out. But ideally, we want to remember whose problem is it. It's really it's their problem. And if we're in a supportive role, but we don't leap in to solve the problem for them, it just helps them develop that brain that just becomes stress tolerant and resilient, because if something stressful happens, they know, I'm going to solve this myself. And they know how to do it. So those are the three implications. And we want basically, it trains kids to look for solutions within themselves. And I was giving a lecture in Houston about the self-driven child about 3 or 4 years ago. And I happened to mention the most elite independent school in the Washington, D.C. area. And I don't remember why, but one of the parents came up to me afterwards and said, I'm a psychotherapist here at the Menninger Clinic, this excellent mental health clinic in Houston. We know this school in DC really well because so many of the graduates, they get into the most elite colleges, but they can't handle it emotionally. So they take a medical leave of absence and they come here. And so we want to, ideally, we think about ourselves more as consultant and encourage kids to figure their life out. Because ideally, our definition of happiness, to have a happy life, is a life that you're happy with. And we see a lot of really high achieving adults who simply aren't happy with their life. So, and also I just want to say that when we talk about the language of a parent consultant, what we're talking about in part is, as Ned said, this language of getting buy-in, rather than just blathering on or trying to force stuff on kids. We say stuff like, I've got an idea about that. Can I run it by you? Or you want to hear my advice? Or just being tentative for whatever it's worth. Or I wonder what would happen if we did it this way. And that we, in our work with kids, and certainly with our own kids, it's just so much, they're so much more receptive if they don't feel forced. And the second aspect of this language of a parent consultant is what we call the language of no force. And it involves basically recognizing that you really can't make somebody do something, including a kid, against their will. And if we're butting heads and there's a lot of stress in our relationship, it interferes with that closeness. And so what we want to do is we want to say, I'm not going to try to force you. I'm not going to try to use the force of my will to make you do things. And then we can negotiate. We can work things out with kids. But taking force off the table is really a powerful way to open up communication. And I'm routinely asked kids to talk kids by their parents, to talk them into something. And I say, I don't believe in doing that, but I'll talk to them about it. And I always start out by telling kids, I'm not going to try to force you. I don't want people to try to force you, but I want you to make a good decision. So let's talk it through. And almost always when we treat them respectfully and we don't try to force, the kids are open to our input, and oftentimes we'll do what we want them to do. And Ned, do you want to take over?
Add really quickly to that terrific point, Bill. When we take force off the table, because if you go back to that nuts, that the low sense of control is so stressful. When we take force off the table and we don't decrease a kid's sense of control, it quiets the stress response and allows the prefrontal cortex to come back online. It makes it so much easier for kids to put things into perspective, to look for solutions, including listening to our advice. Even if it might not be what they want to hear, they can really entertain it because it's something that they can listen to without having it feel like it's forced down their throat. As you can imagine, in both of our books, we take very seriously this importance of autonomy, of having kids, as Bill said, make decisions, solve problems for themselves, because ultimately what we're talking about is wiring their brain that they're going to carry into adulthood, wiring the brains through their experience, not through what we say to them, but through their own experience, the brains that they'll carry into high school and into college and to adulthood. And I think everyone on this call knows very well the pretty harrowing statistics about anxiety and depression and motivational problems and substance use and all kinds of things that seem to bedevil way too many young people. And I don't want to be alarmist about that, but I think it's important for us to acknowledge. And one of the things that really struck us, Bill and I are from the Washington, D.C. area, that we thought had sort of cornered the market on kind of intense, academically successful parents. Bethesda, Maryland, where we're both adjacent to, is the most educated place in the world, statistically, principally because of NIH in terms of college and graduate degrees. So we thought we had it nailed. And then we visited, I don't know, Hinsdale, Chicago, maybe Palo Alto, and you find some places where there are also a bunch of really, really successful academic parents, whose kids may be feeling more pressure than they want. And this isn't, by the way, this isn't intended to give anyone who is on join us tonight a hard time, but rather that there are really macro forces, macro messages that kids are receiving that, when they're too much, they have the impact of pointing kids in a path that's not quite where we want them to be. We want your kids to be as successful as they can be, as academic as they can be, because it's good for them and their futures and your families and your schools and that's good for the whole darn country to develop talent. But we think we want to do this in a way that's that's healthy and balanced, so that we can be successful and with healthy mental health. And a part of this that we talk about in both books is the really powerful value of people who are in charge, which includes educators and parents and, I don't know, heads of companies or whatever, to move in the direction of being what we describe as a non-anxious presence. We borrowed this from a wonderful consultant and actually a rabbi of all things named Edwin Friedman. And the idea behind this is that all emotions are contagious. All emotions are contagious, including especially fear. And so when we've seen all over the country, all kinds of kids and families and schools who have just way too much stress, with second graders in Seattle who are in full school refusal, kids in Dallas, boys in your math class who are like overwhelmed by the pressure of doing well in math in fifth grade. And what occurred to us is it can't be, this family did this or this school or whatever. These are kind of messages that are in the air, that are in the zeitgeist, and messages about, and how do we convey these messages? It's through, through our language, through, all these whiz bang, technologies that allow us to constantly check on our kids, which short term makes us them and us feel safer, but long term doesn't work so well. There's a wonderful research, actually, we talk about in the book, named Jessie Borelli out of UC Irvine, who has this, I think, an example that a lot of people may identify with. So she researches parental over control. So she has this kind of clever experiment where she brings in a bunch of 12 and 13-year-old kids, plunks them down in front of a computer and gives them a digital puzzle. It looks easy. It's not. Drag along mom is just kind of moral support, ostensibly. And then have them sit there. But to really sort of disempower mom, they give her one instruction, which is simply this: you can offer moral support, but don't help them. Don't give them advice, which really works against their nature, because they naturally want to help and give advice, because, who doesn't want to do that for a kid? Puzzle looks easy. Turns out it's not. The more they work with this, the more frustrated the kids get. The more frustrated they get, the more stressed they get. And they measure this with a heart rate monitor that the kid has on. And their kids' distress pretty hard on the moms. How do they know? They have a heart rate monitor on. And as the kids' stress goes up, so does the moms, because they're wired to care for and be interested in their kids being happy and not being stressed. And then 201, every single mom breaks the only instruction, which was, don't give advice. So they cover up and they say, no, sweetheart, boot over the left. No, the other left. And they start giving advice, which makes them feel better, because it's hard to sit on your hands when your kid is struggling. It's hard to button your lip when your kid is, frustrated by this. And when moms finally, and this is true of parents, not just moms, and when moms jump in and start giving advice, they feel a higher sense of control. Woohoo! How do they know? Their stress goes down. Heart rate, did. There's only one problem, and it's this: that the kid's stress continues to go up, because their sense of control has gone down. They're not only struggling, but they're feeling criticized. So the takeaway is this: that all emotions are contagious. When the kid is stressed, the mom gets stressed. When the mom is stressed, the kid gets stressed. It's how we're wired as human beings. The good news is, lest I make you all crazy, like I'm not supposed to help my kid with homework. The good news is this: calm is also contagious. We actually found out, someone pointed out this, that calm is contagious is a mantra of the Navy SEALs. These are folks who are pretty used to dealing with high stress situations. So how can we convey a non-anxious presence, knowing that if I'm less stressed, it also helps all the people around me, including my kids, lower their stress response, and they think more clearly. They find problems, they put things into perspective. We can do this with our language. We can do this with our interactions. So John and Julie Gottman, who are these fantastic researchers on relationships, principally marital relationships, finds that in order to keep things happier, more non-anxious, more, a glass half full, it's a little bit intense, but it's important for you to know that to keep things kind of we need to have a ratio of positive interactions to negative interactions that's more positive than negative. Turns out, this is maybe hard homework for many of us, we really want 5 positive for 1 negative, which feels like a lot of interactions, but that's where we want to be, so that when I, as a dad, lose my temper and I say something like wasn't that well thought out, it was impulsive, my kids can be like, dad's having a bad day, and not feel picked on. Because most of the time, if I'm doing things well in a positive interaction, they're just saying dad's having a bad day rather than I'm a bad kid for doing this. Turns out this is also borne out by the research on language itself. Positive words have less impact than negative words. If you put someone in a functional MRI and just say the word no, you see this cascading of stress reaction through the brain. So we want to be really purposeful in as much as we can, using language that is not negative, that's more positive, and saying like, even just things like, most of the time things work out, or you don't have to be good at everything, or even the best at, at everything, you're good enough, for now. Or I love you, particularly when kids are not doing well, because when kids are really struggling, if they're anxious or depressed, they're super attentive. They've kind of this negativity bias, and they really glom onto negative words. And so you can say things like, listen, kiddo, I want you to do better, but I love you no matter how well you do or how hard you try. That actually lowers the stress and makes it easier for kids to work harder. And the last thing is there are a lot of scientifically validated methods for lowering stress. The way increasingly the Bill and I kind of think about this is that we all want to stay, if we can, more upbeat, more glass half full, more or less down in the dumps, and more like, we're going to get through this, even changes that we don't like. And there are processes for this. If you have more stress coming into your nervous system or your school system or your family system, then you have healthy ways to bring stress out. This is where we become really vulnerable to substance use disorder. This is where we become really vulnerable to screaming at other people, because if I yell at Bill, it lowers my stress. He feels worse, but at least temporarily I feel better. And we don't want to do this to the people we love, right? You know, when your kids aren't doing things, you say, look, I love you too much to fight with you about your homework, but gosh, can we figure out a way to get through here? So one of the processes, and I won't dwell on it too much, but Bill's been a practitioner of what's called transcendental meditation for 47 years. He is the most unflappable person you will ever meet. I started under, his influence doing TM about 10 years ago. Not everyone's going to do this, but it's a tool, and everyone needs one or more tools. And the story that I'll tell, which I hope I won't dwell on too long either, I have downstairs, I have my 19-year-old son, is a sophomore in college. He's currently home because in the middle of the summer, he was diagnosed with a brain tumor. Now, lest anyone get super worried, he chose the right kind of brain tumor because doggone it, that's the kind of kid he is. And we're almost out of the woods. We've finished chemo. We're moving on to radiation. So hopefully I'll have a glass of champagne at New Year's. But here's the deal. This was hard. I mean, it's about as close as you get to a nightmare that any parent can experience. This was hard. So what's my role? What's my wife's role is to help him have confidence, because we can't know anything about this, but to have confidence that this is going to come out well enough, because what else can you hope for? Sorry, it's been a moment. And my wife, we're like 2 weeks into this, and she said, people keep saying to me, how are you so calm about all this? Partly we had a really great team here in DC where we are, but she said, honest to goodness, I really think it's the meditation, because she's from a family that is very tightly wound. We love them, but they're tightly wound. And she said, honestly, I don't think before I learned to meditate that I can handle this, because all of us have parts of our lives that are stressful, some of them really stressful. And if we want to help our kids pull stress out of their nervous system so their brains work better and they wire the brains that we want them to have, as Ms. Bill said before, adversity plus support, we can be supportive, including supporting their autonomy, if we ourselves are more non-anxious. So it's a quick word of praise for sleep and exercise and meditation and spending time with friends, because if we have healthy ways to lower stress up in our nervous system, rather than being to our kids, we could be a stress sponge and help them wire the brains for stress tolerance that we want all kids to have.
I know this kid who has autism, and when he was 17, he and his mom lived in New York, learned transcendental meditation. And the mom knew a New York Times reporter, and he came out to the house to do a story on the mom and kid meditating together. And the reporter said to the kid, what is TM? What do you notice from TM? And he said, it calms the mind and it calms the mom. Makes it more of a non-anxious presence. And I also wanted to mention, Ned, that we talk a lot about what we don't want to feel sorry for kids, in part but we don't want them to feel sorry for themselves. And so we want to look at what they're going through. This is okay. I wouldn't choose this necessarily, but they can grow from this, and this is okay. And I had to work to apply this to Matthew, to your son.
Yeah.
That I don't want him to feel sorry for himself, and he's such a courageous kid anyway. I mean, he probably wouldn't, but so I want to transition, because typically we would talk about motivation. We talk in both of our books about motivation, but because this talk is primarily about stress tolerance and resilience, I just want to make a couple points. And one is that the best model we think for developing that intrinsic, that self-drive, that healthy motivation to develop yourself so you have something useful to offer this world is self-determination theory. And it says that to be internally motivated, you have to have three needs met: for a sense of competence, a sense of relatedness, and a sense of autonomy. And in every place that we've talked about our books around the country, the huge emphasis is on competence, on achievement. And we think that we really undermine kids that self-motivation, that healthy drive, as opposed to kind of anxious drivenness, by not supporting autonomy and not focusing on that really high priority on a relationship. And the other thing I mentioned is that's related to this topic is that so many of the kids we see, especially if they're not doing well, we use fear to try to motivate them. And I visited a Catholic school. I went to a school meeting on a kid that I tested and a couple of years ago. And the kid had learning disabilities and ADHD, and school was hard for him. And he was in 8th grade and applying out to Catholic high schools, and he was just doing terrible. And the principal at the meeting, who I really liked, the principal said, I've had 2 meetings with him to try to get him to understand how important it is that he turn this around. This is a 4-year decision. And I said, respectfully, my sense is it's not lost on the kid that if he does better, he'll have more options for high school. I also think that because the most common manifestation of anxiety is avoidance. We avoid stuff that makes us anxious. So my sense is the more we try to make him motivate him through fear, you got to change this. The more he just avoids his work. And so I asked him to tell him it's not that big a deal. I mean, who's going to care when you're 30? Who cares where you went to high school? And just have to let him know, I want you to work hard and I want you to develop yourself. But where you go to high school is just not that big a deal. And taking the pressure off really kind of counterintuitively possibly increases kids' motivation. And Ned, so often parents say to me, how do I motivate my kid? And what they're really saying is, how do I get my kid to change? How do I help my kid change? And we talk in our new book about the science of change. Ned, you talk so well about this. Why don't you take over?
Yeah, no, I mean, in part, especially when things aren't going well. I mean, all the fears that we have about our kids, they're not really about the present, they're about the future. And we have this sense of my kid is, is a C student, is a B student now. I mean, they're never going to have an A quality life. And so we then invest all this energy in trying to change what the problem is now, thinking that this will change the whole future. And I just don't see it happening that way. I mean, if I can, Bill, I'll go back one thing really quickly about the non-anxious presence. It's probably a little bit easier for Bill and me than it is maybe for some other folks. I mean, Bill is a clinical neuropsychologist, had a lifetime working with kids who, were really kind of hot messes when they were 7 or 12 or 17, even 22, and then gets to see the long arc of those lives and see kids end up being really successful in ways that weren't apparent when they were younger kids. And, I find myself I find it much easier for me to tolerate hard things, including my kids' health challenges right now, because of the experiences that I had as a young person. And goodness knows I don't want to relive them. But it was this. I mean, my father was an alcoholic who eventually drank himself to death. And my mother, partly because of that, struggled with mental health issues. And I spent a good 3 months of 7th grade in pediatric psychiatric hospital. And I went from being the kid who got the best grade on every exam and every quiz and every paper and every class that I took, because I was a pretty good learner and school wasn't that hard for me, and good teachers, to doing absolutely zero for 3 months of 7th grade. But when I came back, I still, despite this really kind of rough detour, I still wanted to be successful. I wanted my life to work out. And even when kids are just kind of and they still want their lives to work out. It's just that right now they're doing the best they can, and their best doesn't look like much. And when we see kids in that situation where school's a mess or friends are a mess or they're doing all kinds of things we don't want them doing, we tend to, get really afraid about this is what their whole life is going to be. And we don't see it working out that way. And there's some really fun some psychology that supports this. There's something called motivational interviewing. This is from a couple psychologists who in the 80s were working with problem drinkers, alcoholics. And traditionally what happened was someone's drinking way too much. And then my God, man, you've got to stop drinking. You're going to lose your health. Your wife's going to leave you. You're going to lose your job. You're going to be, as though if you gave me one more reason of something important that I was going to lose and the terrible place that I would be, that fear would motivate me to change. But it didn't. What happened is people would just go into denial. You don't know what you're talking about, or they would fight the person who's trying to help them. And it's just kind of a disaster. And the two great insights out of motivational interviewing are these. One, that we have a righting reflex. if someone brings us a problem, especially someone we care about, our mom or dad, our children especially, brings us a problem, we naturally launch into, how do we solve this? Well, you got to do this, you got to do this. Here's what you should do. Here's what you should do. But the other insight is this, that the person who shared the problem is ambivalent about change. So if you take that kid that Bill was talking about, who was, really stinking things up in 8th grade, it's not lost on him. If he did better, he'd get better grades. He'd have more choices for high school. His parents would be happy. His teachers would be proud of him. His friends wouldn't think he was such a, screwball. All sorts of reasons why this would really benefit him. But there are a whole bunch of other reasons why it might be hard to do that. I'd have to play less Xbox. I'm teasing, of course, but maybe I'd have to work hard at things that I don't care about. I'd have to, do my best for teachers I don't like. And I might work as hard as I can work consistently and get grades that are a little better. And now I might realize that this is the limit of all I can do. And that's really scary. And so what we do with motivational interviewing is we recognize we have this natural tendency to want to fix things, but kids have, and people have this natural ambivalence, meaning that when we argue one side of the equation, they will start to argue the other side of the equation. So the harder we pull, the harder they fight back. And it's like a stuck door and we're not getting anywhere. So here's the path out of this. What they found was if you use open-ended questions and validating the statements, that reflective listening that we talked about with the wigging, we create change talk. So here's what it looks like. There's a wonderful story. We love this. We have a great friend who's a really good school counselor, public high school, and she caught wind of a girl who was smoking a lot of pot. No amount of pot is a particularly good idea, but what she was smoking, not so good. So she has this conversation with the girl. So, can we arrange a time to talk? First thing she does is Bill talked about before, takes force off the table. I'm not going to try to talk you out of smoking pot. I will not be the umpteenth adult that tells you all the reasons why. I know you've heard it. I know you're a smart kid. I know you understand that. However, I'm interested in understanding your perspective. Like, what does it do for you? Open-ended questions. So the girl goes on to tell her about how, she likes the kids she hangs out with. She thinks they're really funny. They're kind of cool. She feels cool. She feels less relaxed when she's, high, blah, blah, blah. Our friend repeats this back to her reflective listening. Eventually the girl says something like, it is kind of expensive though. That would be the place where most parents, including me, would jump, well, there's your reason, right? But she doesn't do that because she's trained in this stuff. And she says, well, tell me more about that. What would you, she says, well, I buy a couple times a week, and it uses pretty much all the money that I got. Open-ended question again. Well, if you had more money, what would you do with it? Well, my friend Charlene has these really cute shoes. I'd love to get a pair of those, but hers are red. I get blue. It'd be great. And I don't know, I'd probably get my hair done. I haven't done my hair in a while. Well, that makes sense to me. Open-ended questions, reflective listening, validation. She parts ways with a kid, and sees her a couple weeks later. She has her hair done. Sidles up to her. Hey, so tell me about that. Oh yeah, well, I got my hair done. Oh, that's great. It looks really cute. Where'd you get the money? Oh, well, actually, last week I decided to only buy once, and so I was able to get my hair done. Do you like it? I do. It really looks good. Because here's the final insight from motivational interviewing. While people are ambivalent, they have as many reasons to argue to make the change as they do to not make the change. It's when people can articulate for themselves doing the very thing that's probably going to benefit them, but about which they are ambivalent, way more powerful than having someone else lay on to them the reasons, the very same reasons. When they hear it from themselves, way more apt to do that. That's the point at which we have buy-in. And then they go back to the consultant approach, as Bill talked about before, of then being open to help from teachers, help from their parents, of how can I make the change? Because this is going to be hard, and I know that, but I now have reasons to want to make that change.
So Ned, I think we just have a couple more minutes here.
Sure.
Before we open up to questions. We would certainly, we if any questions about talking with kids about sleep or technology. Certainly sleep is one of the most important things for kids in terms of building that stress tolerance and resilience. But also, one of the most interesting chapters, I think, in our book is it's called Talking with Kids About the Pursuit of Happiness. And we're enamored of the work of Laurie Santos at Yale, who is a psychology professor who lived in residential dormitories with undergraduates, and was struck by how miserable the undergraduates, how just stressed and exhausted and miserable the undergraduates at Yale were. So she started teaching a course on the science of happiness, what makes people happy, that quickly became by far the most popular course in the history of Yale University. We had experiences like being at a school in Texas and asking these high school kids, these high school student leaders, what do you understand it takes to be happy as an adult? And one kid saying, well, we understand if you get into a good enough college, everything else is set. And it turns out that it's pretty far from the truth. And so we have a chapter about talking with kids about what actually makes human beings happy. And it turns out that achievement is part of it. But it's only kind of 1/5 of the formula, which includes nurturing positive emotions and active engagement, really stuff that you're really passionate about, whether it's volleyball or coding or football or dance and it's relationships. And talking to kids about the importance of our relationships and really valuing their relationships. It's about helping kids find do things that are meaningful and paying attention. What are your highest values? What's really meaningful to you? And then and the achievement is certainly part of it, but it's only part of it. And so we get a lot of mileage talking with this about kids to really help them understand what they can be focusing and what they can put their attention on to help to develop a happy life. And Ned, we should probably take questions just a minute here.
Yeah, and I just add one quick point to that. I mean, there's some, we talk about this in the book, there's some fun exercises that are both conversations and even writing exercises about having kids write about who they are and their core values, and just recognizing that, you know, again, we want all kids to be as academically successful and as athletically and artistically successful, but recognizing that they're more than just the grades and test scores and college admissions actually improves performance, because when they realize that my whole sense of myself is not in jeopardy if I don't get an A on this particular math test or whatever happens to be, you know, I'm still a person who's involved in this and a great friend and a daughter and a person of faith and a volleyball player and whatever it happens to be, it lowers the stress and the avoidance that Bill talked about that comes along with stress, and actually makes it easier for people to perform well and be more motivated and be more stress tolerant because they're happy. So it's rather than being successful that makes you happy, in many ways, all these things that help us be happy lead to greater success long term. So, you know, again, we'll jump over the questions. You know, we wrote this book because, you know, Bill and I combined have some 65, almost 70 years talking one-on-one with kids. And, you know, nothing can be more
I obviously have the
painful.
lion's share of that, maybe.
Well,
yeah.
So Bill's got a couple years ahead of me. Yes. So, you know, but nothing can be more painful than being a loving parent, as all of us try to be, and wanting to share advice and to help our kids. And the what is right, but the how, it misses the mark. And our friend goes, Dad, you just don't understand. And then they run to the room and they slam the door. And you're like, oh my, how did that go so wrong? And so we wrote this book kind of as a how-to manual. There are all these scripts of the things that pop up of talking about technology and sleep and grades and everything else, because we just want you, as you know, as loving parents who love your kids, and you want the same thing for your kids that Bill and I want for our kids, and in Bill's case, grandkids, because he's the old guy. I'll give you a hard time there, pal. And this is based in psychology and science, and we hope it helps you, because goodness knows it has never been easy to be a parent. And if this last year feels like it's at least a notch up, if not a quantum leap more difficult, it's hard. It's hard, and we hope that it helps. And we'd love to hear your questions, because I know we've talked at a very kind of high level here, but I'm sure there's some nitty gritty questions that you might like to throw at us, and we can help. We'd love to do that.
Well, thank you so much, Ned and Bill, for all those words of wisdom. For any of you parents who joined us a little bit late, this is their new book, What Do You Say? How to Talk with Kids to Build Motivation, Stress Tolerance, and a Happy Home. Tonight, specifically because you're looking at some change for your kids with schools closing. We've been talking more about stress tolerance and resilience. So here's a great question that came in. Let's start here. Parent asks, I like the idea of being consultants for our kids, especially as they get older. However, my parents were immigrants and very hands-off in high school because they didn't know how to be more involved. Now I'm involved in my children's lives the way I wish my parents had been. My kids don't seem to want it. How do I balance this?
You know, I came up with this parent as consultant idea in 1986. I wrote a piece in McCall's magazine, simply called "I Love You Too Much to Fight with You About Your Homework." And one of the things I clarified, so the idea is to say, I'm willing to do anything I can to help you, but I'm not willing to fight with you. I love you too much to make this a big hassle every night. And I'll do anything I can to support you. I'll be your homework consultant, that kind of idea. And one of the things I emphasize, it's not that we're saying back off or back out of the kid's life. I love being involved with my own kids' lives, especially including with their learning. But I didn't force. And it's when it feels forced and it feels like we're taking responsibility for something that's theirs, that doesn't work. And very often my son had some learning issues and attention problems. And very often I'd be his consultant. Frequently he wanted my help. Other times he didn't. And it was really, when he wanted my help, it was really fun. But I think that what I'd suggest is ask your kids, how can I help? Is there a way I can support you? And just see if you can get buy-in for something that they want. And if they say, no, not really, then we want to say, well, I have confidence in your ability to make decisions about your life. And let's see how it goes. And you're smart enough to figure out if you need help or not. Ned, you want to add?
I think that's exactly right. And if you change your mind, I'm here.
Yeah.
I'm here. I mean, I have a daughter who's probably in the next room or downstairs somewhere, who's a senior in high school. And oh man, is she a cool kid. But Bill says she makes you do every tool you think you got in your bag. She's brilliant, just kind of otherworldly IQ, and even more stubborn than her dad. And so it's like, oh, gracious. And I figured this out probably when she was like 10, that there was just no forcing her to do things, because she would put her feet in the ground and cross her arms. And it's just like, good luck moving this kid. And as I reflect on it, it's probably good to have young women who are like, nope, you're not going to make me do it, pal. But I think I know some things. I think I can help. And so very early on, it'd be exactly as you described, Bill, is there a way that I can help with that? And what oftentimes would happen is she'd figure the thing out by herself. And if you go back to Rat A and Rat B, it's way better for her to figure it out by herself than to have me be the person who would solve it. But like this past weekend, she was just not in a good mood this past weekend. She's like, will you help me clean my room? It's kind of a disaster. I'd be happy to help you. She goes off and does work. Can you look over this calculus thing? Because I'm a little confused by this. Okay, it was easier to clean your room, but I'm happy to help, right? And so I love, for the person who wrote this, I love that you want to be involved with your kid's life. And I love that you're able to in ways that your parents couldn't. I'm sorry that they weren't there. And so your instincts to want to help are exactly right. My hunch is, if you do exactly what you're doing, but rather than jumping in, if you simply ask, can I help you with that? Would you like? And when they say, and probably the first 3 or 4 times they'll say no, because they're just testing whether you actually believe it. And I say, okay, well, I'm confident you got it. Just as Bill said, if you need my help, let me know. Or if that's a little bit bridge too far, if you say, okay, can I check back in an hour just to see how you're doing? It's a way that you are conveying both your support, and by offering help, and your confidence in them by not forcing it. And that's exactly what we want to do as parents. It's confidence and support and respect, for that matter.
And one thing I've learned from you both is to have kids as part of the discussion. So I would also suggest telling that exact story to your child and saying, when I was growing up, my parents weren't involved and I wish they were. So now I'm really involved. Maybe it's too much. Let's talk about it. What do you think? And give them some space. I mean, my mother died when I was 18, so I vowed I would be a really good mom. I know sometimes I overdo it, and then I remember to back out.
We'd give you an A, if not an A+, certainly. Just throwing out there. But anyway, back to you.
But that's what I've learned from you both, is ask that question and then pause.
Well, it's so good. I mean, so often I see families where the parents are and the kids are fighting about schoolwork. I simply say, write up a contract, talk with the kid about ways that he wants you to help him, and anything that's not productive. It's exactly having that conversation, because part of doing this, it's not only helps to solve the problem in the moment, it treats kids respectfully. They want their life to work, and we don't want and that treating kids respectfully is the way that they develop a respectful attitude towards other people. And I think also just including them in solving problems is one of the best things we can do to help them to get ready to run their own life.
You know, I want to say we have some really great questions coming in, so let's get at them and see how many we can take. Thank you again, parents, for these really thoughtful questions. This is a good one. Is it helpful or harmful for our kids to see us fighting the decision of school closures? Should we just accept it? Or is it healthy for us to see us fighting for something we think is important?
Well, I think that that ideally, because stress is contagious, because what we want to communicate to our kids is confidence and courage rather than fear. I think if we try to do two things, we try to remember that my kids, everything works better if I can be a non-anxious presence. And you think about, I mentioned very early in my talk, or I talk about the SPACE program, this new program for treating anxiety in kids that only works with parents. And actually it incorporates principles from nonviolent resistance from Gandhi. And I just lost my train of thought. Ned, where do you
Well,
guys
and
go?
what I would jump in there really quickly is that, you know, we want people to be able to, we want to model for our kids advocating for what we think is important. But as I mentioned really briefly before, most mental health is changing thinking from I have to I want to. And so goodness knows, I don't really know the schools that you're all in, but from what I understand, that, you know, from Allison, you know, that these are wonderful, 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 wonderful schools. And you all have every reason in the world to want to keep them open. And so it's what you want, and that makes all the sense in the world. But to give a message that we have to, that if somehow these schools close, that life is over, that our kids can never be successful academically, that they can never build the lives they want, is one, probably not true. Because there are all kinds of, you know, people have all sorts of adversity and they figure out another path. It's just not the path that we think we're on. So I think it's an interesting challenge of a balance and say, you know, it's important for us to speak up and to advocate for what it is we think is important and what we want, but not necessarily do in a way that it's all or nothing, that it's scorched earth policy, because you know, one, I just don't think that's a healthy way to you know, that's a zero-sum game and take no prisoners kind of life. I just don't think that's probably what I would want to be modeling to kids. And it also, from a fear perspective, to pick up on Bill's point of non-anxious presence, to say that if we don't prevail, if we don't keep these schools open, that your life is ruined, is probably not the place where we want to be. So we work hard for plan A, but we think about the plan B. That same Sonia Lupian, who Bill talked about with the nuts of novelty, unpredictability, threat, low sense of control, she said the single best cure for anxiety is plan B thinking. So we fight like the Dickens for plan A. Keep the schools open. We love these schools. We want to keep the schools open. But start working on plan B and saying, if that doesn't work, how can we navigate this? How can this still work out well enough, if not exactly the way we want it to?
And I'll mention too, Ned, that I was talking with a friend of mine who referees high school, college, and soccer games. And he said that they just can't, across the country, they can't find enough people to referee because the parents are so abusive. And I'm thinking, what's it like for kids to see their parents and son go ballistic? What's the message to the kid? That you can't handle this, you couldn't handle not be in the wrong call. And I just think that so much of what we want to do is express confidence that kids can handle stuff. And so I think I completely agree with what you said. Do the advocacy, but do it as calmly and peacefully, and have a plan B.
All right, and I think that leads us perfectly into the next question, another really good question. Parent asks, do you have any tips or how to deliver empathy authentically in the heat of an interaction? Sometimes it's hard to conjure up an authentic sense of empathy when things your child is saying are triggering your fears for them and their future, and you're strongly tempted to judge and lecture.
And what we suggest is that because when we get stressed, none of us can think straight. We evolved to respond to stressful situations through fight or flight. We didn't respond to think thoughtfully. And so if we get triggered by whatever kids are going through or whatever they're saying, that we really can't put our best foot forward. And what we suggest is say, look, I want to be helpful here. I really want to understand. I want to be able to help. But my brain's not working because I feel stressed right now. I'm going to take a walk. Let's come back in 10 or 15 minutes. And let's try this again, because I love you more than anything. I really want to help you. I really want to understand. But I just can't, my brain won't do it right now.
Oh, that's also where reflective listening is so effective. I mean, oftentimes when schools, when they're trying to solve a problem with things, I will repeat back to Bill what I think I understand him to feel. He'll repeat back to me what I think, and one, it buys us both a little bit of time, but it also helps Bill feel that I understand his perspective, that he understands mine. And it also, when I start to kind of and try to really think, how is he seeing this? It makes it much more likely that I can start to feel empathetic about him. I will share that I have a colleague at work. I'm pretty left of center, and she's not left of center at all. But I adore her. I mean, she's just an incredible human being. And some of this is just the personalities they have, probably more credit to her than to me. But we can talk about things and disagree agreeably. And it's one of the relationships I cherish as much as any in my life. And I just thought, goodness knows, wouldn't our country and our world be a better place if we could disagree agreeably? Because though I think I have the right thinking on everything, that can't possibly be true. There have to be people who are thinking about things differently, and I'm just not right. I just don't know it yet, right? And so for me to be able to express my thoughts, but also to hear other people's thoughts, that has to be better for us as communities, because we don't always all agree. And so I think that working on this with our kids is something that's really valuable. And certainly I agree with Bill, because I when I'm in my moments, I can get a little hot. And I find that, what I need to do, I need to go for a run, sometimes short, sometimes long, to come back and be able to engage in these conversations that are in ways that are real. I would also say this, that there's a tendency for us as grownups to use our superior, strength, our reasonability, our, even just our energy to prevail upon kids. And particularly if you've got young kids, we want to really validate kids if they make arguments that are even credible, because we want kids to develop the skills of speaking up and advocating on their behalf. And it's so easy as parents to always win an argument with kids. But if kids can't use their reason in ways that are calm and more thoughtful, then they're going to resort to tantrums and name calling and being deceitful and all the things we don't want them to do. So, once in a while, you might even purposely kind of let your kid win an argument, so long as their argument holds some merit and they've done it in some reasonable way, even if you don't agree with it. Because, Bill, some years ago, in talks we've done, he said, the older that he's gone, and certainly the same thing for me, the older that I've gone, I've just developed more and more humility, that as much as I think I know what's right, I really don't always know what's right for my kids. And what I think needed to be done turned out to be wrong. And my kids turned out to be right about things. And I just think the more humble we can be about that, the more open we can be and empathetic to how our kids are seeing their world, because it is their life.
Well, and also in the heat of the moment, don't you think, gentlemen, that it's okay for parents to give themselves a timeout, just to say, you know what? I need a little break, and then I want to come back and talk to you about this.
Absolutely. And as Bill pointed out before, and as you used to say to Charlene, I would really just call that out and say, look, I'm feeling really hot, and really be clear that not that I'm mad at you, I'm feeling really stressed, and it's just, and say, I need 10 minutes. I'm not mad at you. I'm frustrated by the situation, because we don't want kids to feel like they said something that made us mad and now we won't talk to them. It's just, I need my brain to come back online, and just really call it out for what it is.
Bill, you have a comment on that?
No, I just think that the parents timing themselves out but what we talk about in our new book is that we want to communicate to kids prefrontal cortex to prefrontal cortex thoughtfully. Because as I said, once we get stressed or a kid gets stressed, that you can't think straight. We didn't evolve to be able to think straight. And so much of our communication when we're stressed is lecturing or arguing or scolding or trying to guilt kids. And it just that doesn't do anything for our relationship, and it rarely has any positive effect on the kids. So I think that ideally, we say, that my brain's not working right now, and I need to take a break. And but also, I really want to help. I really want to figure this out with you.
Okay, and one other thing I'd like you gentlemen to comment on is, and I've heard you say this many times, is sometimes, we parents, we say things we wish we hadn't. We get hot in an argument just like this. It means a lot to us. These are our kids. If you do say something that you wish you hadn't said, are you, and I know what you're going to say, but please tell parents, are you advocates of parents coming back and apologizing?
Well, I think you heard me say, Charlene, that I'm old enough now that I can't remember specific instances, but I remember when I was in my 40s, I could still remember times when my father had gotten mad at me about something and yelled at me or something and scolded me. And it came in at night into my bedroom and said, son, I want you to know how much I love you. And I'm sorry. I said, I really had a hard day at work. I'm sorry I went off on you. You're a great kid. And I just remember how respected I feel and how I felt and how much respect I had for him, for being able to humble himself and apologize. And I realized just how much he cared about me by saying, I don't want you to think that what I said in anger is really how I feel.
Well, gentlemen, we have just a few more minutes together. We want to be respectful of your time and attendees, all of your time. So I'm going to ask each of you, starting with Ned, if you could just give us some final words for parents who have kids right now that are looking at some really kind of tough transitions. And we want them to be healthy and happy. We love them and we want all the best for them. Ned, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, cognitive flexibility and emotional flexibility are a core executive functions, right? And so we want to be able to look at the situation, figure out what the best plan or best plan B is, be able to put things in perspective. We want to be able to navigate that situation as well as we can. There's a wonderful researcher named Adele Diamond who studies executive functions. He has this great line that I just really like, where she says, if you're sad or lonely or tired or stressed or in poor physical health, that those executive functions, including problem solving and mental flexibility, will be impacted first and impacted most. And so it just makes, so we get stuck, we get in a situation we can't see it a different way. And so if we can focus as teachers, as parents, as friends, and help people feel less lonely, less sad, less stressed, certainly less tired, sleep helps enormously. And that, that sad, lonely, that goes back to that relationship that we've been talking about from the get-go. It particularly when things aren't going well or when kids aren't doing well, it doesn't seem intuitive to us as parents or as educators to really focus on the relationship rather than the thing. We can feel like if I'm loving my kid too much when he's stinking the joint up, that I'm somehow approving of this terrible thing, bad grades or bad behavior, whatever he's doing, and that's not okay. And what turns out is we don't change the kid by changing the behavior, right? We change the behavior by changing our relationship with the kid. And so we start and end this book with the relationship, because that's the thing that ultimately we have the most power over. And when we can really focus on, I love you no matter how hard you work, no matter whether you do your homework or not, I just love you, I love you, I love you. That's what changes kids, puts their prefrontal cortex in a state where they can be more flexible and they can handle all the challenges, including the changes that look to be a big part, of the world in your corner of the world, at least for the time being.
Thank you, Ned. That's really great advice. Bill, how about you?
Well, I'll just mention that I when I was in third grade, the zoning where I lived in Seattle changed, and I went from Pinehurst Elementary to Sacagawea Elementary from third to fourth grade.
That's harder to spell.
Well, it is. Well, yes. I was kind of an anxious guy. I was really nervous about it, but I had, so I knew some of my friends were going too. And I like Sacagawea better than I like Pinehurst. And so I think that so often we think we can predict the future. And as Ned was saying, so often we think that I know this is going to be terrible. And so many things that the kids that when I used to do therapy, something would be happening really hard, and I didn't know how to solve. I mean, and people come back a couple weeks later and say, well, it actually what was happening then led to something really good. And so my feeling is that we want to avoid that fortune telling. I can be sure this is going to be disaster. And the last point, I want to come back to this idea that when I did psychotherapy with kids for years, and I just realized when they feel sorry for themselves, it just doesn't help them. I can express empathy for them, but if I pity them, like somehow this is terrible, it shouldn't be happening, that it weakens them. And so what I started doing was saying that I think it's okay. I think that you can handle this idea. And the last thing I'll say is that, if a kid came to me when he was 30, well, it's unlikely I'll still be working when they're 30, but theoretically, they were 30 and said, my life has been a wash because I had to change schools, then I'd say, kind of get over it. I'd say that we put things in perspective. So again, I think if I don't know the situation out there, but I strongly support parents if they feel the right thing to do is to advocate for not closing schools. Okay. I'm just saying that I think that the way we do it, the attitude with which we do it, and expressing confidence that the kids can handle whatever comes down the pike is one of the most powerful things we can do.
And I can judge that, that always looking for the silver lining. And I'm sort of wired this way from my upbringing, but I had a really rocky start I was a good student in high school, and I had a really rocky start to highly selective, rejected, whatever college I went to. And I wanted to take the first year off from college. I started, and I wasn't happy. And I wanted to take the year off. And my parents said, no, you can't do this. You train wreck everything. So I kind of stumbled my way through my first year of college. And then I started my second year, and the same thing. And I wanted to take it. And I took the year off from college. My parents didn't think it was such a good idea. And I returned in college. And because of the timing, two things. One, I happened to be there at college when my brother when I saved my brother's life from a medical thing. I won't go into the details of it. And I just happened to be there a year delayed in college, and took up with this really adorable young woman who was her first year in college, who would have been kind of scandalous for me to start dating her, being old, but as a year delayed, started dating her. And we just celebrated our 25th wedding anniversary and have two lovely kids there. So some things that look like they're going to be a disaster, sometimes they turn out in ways that you don't expect.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Bill Stixrud and Ned Johnson, for all the wisdom tonight and all the words of advice. And parents, thank you so much for joining us. We are honored and delighted to be here with you tonight. Again, this event has been recorded and will be available for your private viewing. There is a very short link to a survey that we hope you'll take 1 minute to fill out. It helps us with future planning. We promise we read everyone. Thank you so much to Allison Lanier, Associate Superintendent of the Cupertino Union School District, for bringing us to you tonight. We hope that we see more of you. So thank you, everybody. Good evening. Allison, any final words?
Thank you, everyone, for attending tonight, and especially thank you to some of our board members I see in our audience, our trustee Phyllis Vogel, Lori Cunningham, and Sylvia Leong. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for the sponsorship of SEEP. We are so delighted. Take care, stay healthy, and we will see you soon. Good night, everybody.